all sorts of other fantastical characters. You've got Marina, the mother. You've got the other funambulist, Serendipity Wilson. You've got Big Jen. How did you come up with all of these other characters?
So Serendipity Wilson comes from a very special place. She comes from the Isle of Man. And when I was a very small child, I wasn't born on the island, but we lived there. I lived there with my family from being a tiny baby to being about 5 years old. And we moved then to the industrial north of England, where I grew up. But my first memories were of this magical island where I'd heard all these stories of fairies, and I knew a little bit of the folk lore and the folk legend. I did visit the island many times as I was growing up as well. We had friends back there, but I always felt that I'd been snatched away from this beautiful place that I dreamt of, and I was kind of obsessed with fairies and fairy stories from the island. And Serendipity Wilson for me is the embodiment almost of that place, of this childhood, this magical childhood full of mists and full of folklore, which I've always been drawn to. I mean, even when I was doing theatre, I was really drawn to folklore and fairy tale, if you like. And I think it all comes from this sort of early experience of being snatched away from this amazing place. So she kind of embodies that place for me, as she personifies that place. And Big Jen is another one of those characters where she could possibly be a very maternal figure. Even just in her physicality, this big blanket of love that she has for Marina rather than our unnamed narrator. So it's this other kind of sense of a sort of less close related abandonment, because there's always this possibility of this great personage of love that she never gets that maternal love from. So it's layering. I think it's trying to layer the idea of abandonment again. It was such a big idea for me when I was a big theme for me when I was writing the book.
So you touched on the myths and the folklore and the fables that are so important to the story, but why are they so important to the story? Why are these things important? Because the book is almost like a story about stories.
Exactly. So the other thing I wanted to explore, other than the sort of female relationship, and this actually ties in very much with female relationships and how we pass on feelings and histories. So there's stories within stories within stories, and these stories are all passed down from person to person, from woman to woman to woman to child. And I was exploring really the idea of how the stories of our ancestors, of our grandparents, affect our lives. You know, so there's a program in the UK, I don't know if it exists in South Africa, called Who Do You Think You Are? It's a genealogy program, you know, and you see these celebrities finding out where they come from. And then they hear that somebody that lived 300 years ago, perhaps 200 years ago, one of their ancestors died in some terrible circumstance. And you see the celebrity so touched by this, and they're crying. And you know that they will carry that story with them now forever, that they immediately embrace it because it's part of their ancestry. And so I was exploring that as well. I mean, why do we carry these past traumas with us, which have actually nothing to do with us on a very personal level? We carry them with us, and then we pass those stories on, and then we kind of reinvent those stories for ourselves and pass them on again. And then of course we have our own stories to tell, which are either real or made up, and we pass them on, and then they will get passed on. So I was just really interested in this sort of almost chain, this linking of stories from today, from our realities, from our lived realities to the lived realities of the people that have gone before.
So one of the central driving forces for the main character is to find a child who had gone missing when she was still a child. So without giving everything away, just talk to me about how this drives our character forward and what are the circumstances?
So the thing that drives her forward is guilt. So she feels absolutely responsible for this child going missing. And you could say to a certain extent she was, but also she wasn't. She was a child and she was hoodwinked, because children are constantly hoodwinked by adults. That's what happens. But she carries this terrible guilt with her, and that's the motor of the story, to a certain extent, of the greater story of the book, to a certain extent, this search for this child. But there's also another part of that, in that she did love the child. She does have feelings for this child, but those feelings are so mixed up, as we have with our siblings as well. You know, these feelings of terribly intense love, but also real hatred at times, and really you just want them to go away. And if you could do something to make them go away at a specific time, you would. But unfortunately for our protagonist, this does happen, and the child is taken away for good. And so then she has to live with that guilt. So yes, so the motor is guilt, more than a feeling that she just desperately wanted to find the child. You know, it's a very fine line, this idea of guilt and sort of this real desire to do good. I find